Welcome to Second Friday, sponsored by RAAC. I'm Ed Dolman. Thanks to Nancy and Dick Raines and Daly for letting us use their theater. Tonight's program is special. Our speaker is Norm Ornstein, who's one of America's most acclaimed political observers. Norm's newest book is called One Nation After Trump, a guide for the perplexed, the disillusioned, the desperate, and the not yet deported. It immediately rose high on the bestseller list. Norm's won all the honors in his field, but I won't rattle them off for you. I will cite one less formal honor, which is that at one time or another, newsrooms around the country have adopted the Ornstein principle, which is that the management in these newsrooms told their reporters that they had to find some other way to understand the news than calling up Norm and saying, what's going on? They put those bans in place sooner rather than later. They lifted those bans. Norm is that good. I want to talk personally for just a minute because Norm is a dear friend and a friend of Rappahannock's. He's taken time from an overcrowded schedule to visit with us. Norm's been watching politics for a long time now. For him, this isn't a game. He's not a cheerleader for either side. That independence is one reason that his reputation soared so high. He's a man who cares deeply about American institutions and how they came to be and where they might be heading. His focus is less on the horse race of who's winning and who's losing, and more on what it means for American life. Tonight, we had a chance to hear his latest thinking. Please welcome Norm Ornstein.
Thank you, Ed, who's not only a dear friend and a great introducer, but a stagehand. And I'm really delighted to be with you. I did want to embellish a little bit on the introduction. One, I'm neither stable nor a genius. When I was a kid, I did know one stable genius. His name was Mr. Ed.
Yeah.
I would also note, relevant here, that for almost 15 years I taught at Catholic University, and my students included Terry McAuliffe for all 4 years of his college career, from the time when he was 18, and less so, but still a student, Ed Gillespie. So I have unusual ties to both the governance and election defeats here in Virginia. So we're at a very, very strange time and moment in American politics. So I should add one other thing, which is I am the chairman, I'm very proud of this, I'm the chairman of the Campaign Legal Center, which does yeoman work in trying to protect our elections and our campaign finance system from the daily and weekly assaults. And my friend Paul Smith, whom you all know, I'm very proud of that. So a couple of days ago, if you had Googled Trump and shithole, you would have gotten hotel reviews. Well, we're in a different place right now. We are day 357 of the Trump presidency. Or as he would say, longer than any other president. And unfortunately, my hope for a long time, when he got elected, that it wouldn't last long, that he would soon leave us for a younger country. Has not happened. The president had a physical today, and actually some Democrats in Congress have introduced a bill requiring a mental health exam for the president, whereas they're calling it the too little, too late. But we're at an extraordinary and dangerous moment in our history. The book, which I did with E.J. Dion and Tom Mann, we pushed very hard to get out at an early stage because of the threat that we saw. And really, just to talk about it for a minute, and by the way, it makes a great holiday gift. Any holiday. It has three parts. The first part, which I'm not going to talk about very much because I don't want to take so much time on it, is how we got here. And it is simply important to emphasize that Donald Trump did not just arise from nowhere. I will tell you that as we drove out tonight listening to MSNBC on the radio, and Chuck Todd had on Andy Card, who had been the chief of staff to George W. Bush, and he was trying to suggest that the Republican Party has nothing to do with Donald Trump. And that's simply not the case. This goes back a long ways, but it's not just about the Republican Party either. It's a whole series of things in this society that have caused deep divisions over a long period of time, and some of them are unrelated to politics. And that includes the decline of community, which we have seen in so many places. It's been both in the cities and as we moved out to rural areas. It's something that was written about actually quite eloquently by the great sociologist Kai Erikson some decades ago, about a community in West Virginia where there was a close-knit community, and then a flood came through and it destroyed those bonds. And it was written about by William Julius Wilson, the great African-American sociologist, about what happened in the inner city in Chicago and elsewhere when the good jobs disappeared and what happened to the society. We saw it with Bob Putnam and Bowling Alone, and we've seen it in other places. And all of that, which has caused stresses in the society and divisions that transcend politics in some ways and are with us and are part of the challenge that we face. And some of it I would trace back to Newt Gingrich and his arrival in Congress in 1978 and the beginning of the tribalization of American politics. It goes way beyond polarization. You can be polarized and still solve problems. And one of my great twinges of pain these days is watching Orrin Hatch, who I used to refer to as one of the avatars of this, because for decades he would talk about, and it was accurate, how even though he and his great friend Ted Kennedy were at the opposite ends of the political spectrum, they had worked together, they forged this relationship, and his proudest accomplishment was the Children's Health Insurance Program. And it tells you how low we've sunk, that Orrin Hatch, who is now the chairman of the Finance Committee in the Senate, has refused to reauthorize that program, which is already causing some of the 9 million children whose lives depend on having that insurance suffer the losses because states just can't wait any longer to see a program authorized that's already been overdue for several months. But you can be polarized and solve problems, but if you're tribal, you look at people on the other side not as worthy adversaries where you can find common ground or you can horse trade a little bit to accomplish common goals, but as the enemy, trying to destroy your way of life. And Newt had as much to do with creating that process, which he did deliberately over 16 years to try and achieve a Republican majority in Congress, and then recruited a whole generation of acolytes and proteges who took it to the Senate and who helped to transform our politics. And just one little anecdote on that front, which I had to test out to make sure it was accurate. One of the people who was a part of that Gingrich coterie was Rick Santorum, who then moved to the Senate and began to transform the whole culture of the Senate. And Alan Simpson, who remains one of my heroes of public service, after he left the Senate, came back to visit one time, and as he walked onto the floor, he was accompanied by Santorum. And when he walked into the chamber, he saw Dale Bumpers of Arkansas. Simpson, a conservative Republican, Bumpers, a liberal Democrat, and he immediately walked over and they embraced and they were having a warm conversation. And Santorum grew increasingly agitated, and Simpson looked back and saw him, and after a few minutes he went back and he said, "Yeah, what's the problem?" And Santorum said, "What was that all about?" And Simpson said, "Well, that's Dale Bumpers. We came in together, we're like blood brothers, we worked on many things, we're extremely close." And Santorum said, "We don't do things like that around here anymore." And I'd heard that, and I didn't know if it was apocryphal, and I saw Al on the street one day, and I mentioned it to him, and he confirmed that it was accurate. And then I said, "So tell me, was he mad because you were embracing a Democrat or because you were embracing a guy?" And in his inimitable way, he said, "That homophobic son of a bitch." But basically said it was more about how we don't socialize with Democrats in that way. They're not ones we work with, they're the enemy. Now that hasn't completely overtaken the institution, but it's come damn close. And all of that then moves forward to a whole series of processes, whereas elections became more competitive as majorities became closer, and that really started with Gingrich and taking the majority after these tactics worked in 1994. And as the parties began to move further apart, the stakes grew higher, and we saw a whole series of tactics that drove the parties further apart, but that also moved, as Gingrich had hoped for, to demonize Washington and make everything done in politics and government seem corrupt and awful. And that was escalated during the Obama years, and all of it led to, with the populist surge following the financial collapse in the fall of 2008 and the bailout, a very different kind of politics. And we saw Republican leaders in Congress exploit the Tea Party movement and exploit that anger, and it worked for them in the midterm elections in 2010 and 2014. But that helped set the seeds for a Trump emerging. Now, what also helped set the seeds, obviously, too, was difficult economic times and that yawning, growing, stark inequality, income and wealth inequality that created a larger distemper in the country as well. And I wrote a piece in the summer of 2015 when things were just starting to heat up on the presidential side, which was aimed at many of my colleagues in academia and in journalism who had bought into the notion that things haven't really changed and the Republican Party does what will do what it always does. They flirt with an outsider like a Herman Cain, but then they always come back to nominate the heir apparent, the obvious choice, the one who has been waiting in the wings. And this time, of course, that was Jeb Bush. We had Bush 41 and Bush 43. The motto in the family, no child left behind. But I thought that wasn't going to work that way this time. We had 17 candidates, the bulk of them were outsiders, and the hatred for Washington, the unhappiness with even their own elites, and the racial divisions that accompany all of this, the nativism and protectionism that always goes along with a kind of populist surge when difficult times emerge, were going to lead to an outsider. And it wasn't clear to me at that point that it would be Trump, although I thought it was likely to be Trump. It could easily have been, instead of the outsider's outsider in Trump, the insider's outsider in Ted Cruz, whose calling card, after all, was to go on the floor of the Senate to call his own leader, Mitch McConnell, a liar. Or it could have been Ben Carson, the celebrated neosurgeon and African-American conservative who had his own kinds of appeals. It could have been a Carly Fiorina. But Trump emerged, and there are a couple of things important to say about that. The first, of course, is that he became a potential presidential candidate riding on the birther movement. The racism, the rank racism that we see emerging, that now finally commentators are beginning to say directly instead of nudging their way around it, was there when Obama became president. It was a deliberate choice on his part, and it skyrocketed him to a level of prominence that suddenly made a talk show marker have potential as a potential candidate. And then, when he got into the race, and he was just one of several outsiders, what enabled him to emerge from that pack was a few things of importance. The first was he sensed how the immigration issue could work to his advantage. And it's when Trump got to the right of everybody else, with the Mexican rapists coming in over the border and banning all the Muslims and making Mexico pay for the wall. And you could watch on that debate stage as Ted Cruz stood there just absolutely flabbergasted that anybody could get to the right of him on anything. That Trump began to emerge. But the other part of it was Trump's willingness to go after and belittle the other candidates and even take on Fox News. Because a part of the distemper in his own party was the sense that Republican leaders, from Kevin McCarthy and Eric Cantor and Paul Ryan, all the way up through Mitch McConnell, had fed him a bill of goods, had told him that if you brought him to majorities in the House and Senate, they would bring Barack Obama to his knees, and they'd repeal Obamacare and repeal Dodd-Frank and blow up government as we knew it, and none of that had happened. And you could see with Cantor's defeat that there was a different movement out there, and it was Trump saying, I'm not going to take crap from anybody. Whether it's little Marco or Weak Jeb or Fox News, I'm going to stand up to those people, and I'm going to stand up for you. And that enabled him both to win a nomination and to get to within firing distance of actually winning the presidency. So enough about that. Let me talk some now about what is the second part of this book, and that is the dangers we face. The third part is a more hopeful part, and I'm having a harder time. But I'll get to it. In the second part, I want to start with three words: autocracy, kleptocracy, and kakistocracy. Now, the first two are familiar. The third I'll get to. So, autocracy. And I will tell you that one of the chilling moments that I had was looking at the display at the Holocaust Museum, which gives you the signs of a movement towards fascism. And you go down through that list, and it's like check, check, check. So what are the signs of autocracy? You start with challenging, going after, and delegitimizing the press. And here you have Trump calling the press, at the time he became president, the enemy of the people. Now that's a phrase that originated with Joseph Stalin. And what's striking about it is that when Nikita Khrushchev became the head of the Soviet Union, he banned the use of the phrase because he said it's too dangerous. If people are viewed as the enemy of the people, they could be murdered. There's justification for it. And Trump, of course, has not given up on that. Now, related to that is the idea that you not just belittle the press, but you turn the whole notion of truth on its head. And that's a Goebbels-like tactic. You hate to use these analogies, but they're becoming more powerful all the time. And if you say, none of that is true, you can't trust any of them, I'm the arbiter, that's fake news, I'm the one who gives you the real news. You are creating the greatest challenge to the notion of a free society, which depends on debate and deliberation about policy, and it has to start with a common acceptance of a body of facts. And related to that, which also precedes Donald Trump, is a war on expertise. One of the great conservative intellects in the country, a man named Tom Nichols, who teaches at the Naval War College, has written a book called The Death of Expertise. And here I'll go back to Newt Gingrich when he became Speaker. One of his first acts was to abolish the Office of Technology Assessment. We had a strong office, independent office in Congress that had scientists and other experts who would evaluate legislation, who would provide that kind of expertise. Newt said it was a measure, an economic measure. It was designed to throw out the idea that we have independent scientific expertise and have it trumped instead by ideology. And now it's gone way beyond that, obviously, as we see real news treated as fake news and fake news treated as real news, and lies and explicit lies all the time, or as Kellyanne Conway talks about it, alternative facts. Now, next is you attack the independent judiciary, which of course Trump did going back to the campaign with the Mexican judge, which he has done by attacking judges who have ruled against his immigration bans, his travel bans. And then you move on to attack the entire system of justice, which he has done by going after the FBI. And of course, you can broaden that to going after the intelligence entities as well. Now you move from there to the cult of personality. I'm the only one who can fix it. And when we had another element of all of this that we'll get to with cacistocracy, the fact that the key positions in the State Department after the secretary have not been filled, and most of them don't even have nominations. When Trump was asked about this, he said, doesn't matter at all. I'm the only one that counts. Now that's the sort of thing we've seen in Russia. It's the sort of thing we see in Turkey. It's the sort of thing we've seen in Egypt. And we see it in the Philippines as well. And it's another one of those glowing signs. And I'll just mention one other, which is autocrats go after, delegitimize, and try to criminalize their political opponents. And here you can throw a couple of things together where Trump has another embarrassing press conference, in this case with the Prime Minister of Norway, and spends virtually the entire press conference going after Hillary Clinton and all of the questions, followed by Kellyanne Conway going on television and saying, we don't even think about Hillary Clinton much this far. So that's a set of realities, and it doesn't mean we are marching inevitably towards a different system of government, but it's kind of warning signs blinking, neon, all around us about the dangers that we face. And the history of all of this in most countries is that it doesn't happen with one fell swoop. It happens little by little and step by step. And much of it involves something that was heralded in particular by one of my great friends and cherished mentors, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, in his famous article, Defining Deviancy Down. Behavior by our leaders that violates our norms of democracy suddenly becomes normal or acceptable. And a press corps that has too many people who've normalized that, and a system that is overwhelmed by the violations and the outrages, makes it very difficult to deal with. Now, we have a political system that was explicitly designed to try and protect against some of these things. The first sentence of our book actually is the American political system was not designed to have a president like Donald Trump. We have checks and balances built in, and you don't have to have spent the money to see Hamilton to look at what Alexander Hamilton wrote at the time when his fear was Aaron Burr, about how we have to have a system that keeps us from having a leader emerge as a president who has no values, who has no real anchors, who is out for himself. And we have many ways in which we're supposed to do that. The Electoral College, if you go back as it was originally designed, of course, hasn't operated like that in any fashion for many, many decades, was supposed to be a group of sterling citizens who would get together and make sure whatever was happening out there in the election that we didn't end up with a demagogue. Well, that's gone way by the boards. The independent judiciary is another part of it, but a core of it is an independent Congress that puts its own checks on misbehavior by the president. Now, we have a president unlike any other we've seen. He is a kleptocrat through and through, along with his family. He is out to enrich himself and those around him. He has not abided by any of the even restraints he put on himself. If you go back to that press conference that his lawyers held, where they had thousands of pages, most of which probably, if we looked at them, were actually blank, that were designed to make sure there were no conflicts of interest. None of it has happened. We know that we have a president who violated the law starting at 12:01 on January 20th of a year ago by having a lease on a hotel, which he had explicitly promised that he would give up control if he ever held office, but with the General Services Administration for the old post office, a government entity in Washington, in which he has tried repeatedly to renegotiate the terms of the lease, while also trying to force the District of Columbia to reduce the property taxes. The second emoluments clause in the Constitution, which says that a president's salary shall be neither raised nor lowered during the course of the term, but in return for that, the president shall accept nothing else of value from the federal government or the states. That's violated. The first emoluments clause about not accepting emoluments from foreign governments, we have seen violated over and over again as well. And we have a president who doubled the initiation fee to $200,000 at Mar-a-Lago when he became president, has spent more time at Mar-a-Lago and his golf course at Bedminster, golf resort at Bedminster in New Jersey, and who has advertised that if people hold weddings, that there's a pretty good chance that the president will come by and do a photo op with them. Now that's kleptocracy. His family, in a similar fashion. His daughter, his sons, his son-in-law, all the same. His cabinet, which has used government resources for their own pleasure and enrichment. How many hearings in the House or Senate in a year have been held on any of these things? Zero. Not one. We have not seen a single leader or member of his party raise questions about this misuse. And the misuse is not just because it's sort of ugly and seamy to try and make money out of being president. And of course he wears all the time the hats, the shirts, the accoutrements that he sells on his website. He's like a walking advertisement, as his daughter does with her own clothing line. It's much more that the reason the framers were concerned about this kind of behavior was it could shape American policy in directions that moved it away from fitting the national interest. And if you have, as we have seen, a president going to the Philippines, even as his holdings there are highlighted, and saying good things about the way in which Duterte has handled the drug issue there, which includes multiple unauthorized killings. Or if you see the kinds of holdings that he has in places all around the country, shaping the way he's talked about those policies. Or if you think about the fact that China, right after he became president, gave a whole bunch of trademarks to the president and his daughter, which had been held in abeyance for a significant period of time, which means, of course, giving him things that could curry favor, but also the possibility of taking them away if he doesn't conform to those policies. The fact that his travel ban involved countries where he did not have any real estate holdings, but exempted comparable countries that do, tells you that we've got a big problem here. And if you don't have any checks and balances, it makes it that much worse. Now, you also get to the question of whether you have a Congress that's looking at even bigger issues, which include, of course, the relationship with Russia. And as we've seen all of this play out, with Devin Nunes, the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, effectively acting to try and do whatever he can to block any investigation into Russia's role in the election, whatever it has to do with Trump. The fact is we have a foreign power that is our greatest adversary that worked night and day to try and shape the course of the election and is trying night and day to undermine the whole notion of democracy. And that we have the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, along with the chairman of the Constitution Subcommittee, Charles Grassley and Lindsey Graham, totally distorting the testimony given by Glenn Simpson about the dossier, and then moving for a criminal referral of Christopher Steele, the courageous and noble man who got this information not when he was seeking it, but was so alarmed by it that he referred it to the FBI, tells you that we do not have a Congress on the up and up right now. It is not acting in a fashion that we would want. And the events of the last few days, which have highlighted the rank racism that we have in the White House, and have been met with either silence or comments that are almost beyond the pale by Republican leaders in Congress, tells us we've got a bigger set of issues there. Now, the third, kakistocracy. This is a term that goes back to the 17th century and fell out of use and has been brought back now. It comes from a Greek word, and it means government by the least and most unscrupulous among us. And if you want to know the root, just ask any child what kaka means. But it also means the worst kind of government. And so, just to go back to start with, Donald Trump comes into the presidency. By the way, I'm at an age where I'm not going to pull any punches, so I apologize if I offend anybody who still wants to think reasonably highly of the president. Donald Trump comes in with the least experience of anybody who's ever been in that office, right? No service in government at any level, in any way. The one who comes closest is Abraham Lincoln, with a term in Congress. Now, Lincoln responded by bringing into his government people who did have that deep experience. Sometimes people misuse or misunderstand what Doris Kearns Goodwin's thesis was in Team of Rivals. It wasn't that Lincoln was like FDR and bringing people who he could pit against each other. It was that Lincoln brought in people who had run against him, who didn't like him, who didn't respect him much, because he knew that he needed that kind of expertise, and he hoped that he could win them over and that their larger patriotism would take over as well. Donald Trump, who came in with less experience, brought in Reince Priebus, who had been basically a political functionary for his career as chief of staff, Steve Bannon, with a few years in the Navy as his chief, not really co-chief of staff, but chief policy person, Stephen Miller, who is still there, who had been for a couple of years in the Senate staff of Jeff Sessions, Kellyanne Conway, who had been a pollster, a group of people around him in the White House with no experience in running anything in the executive branch or understanding much of anything about how policy worked through that executive branch. And of course, filled his cabinet with people mostly without substantive expertise, and most of whom themselves had come right out of the world of Goldman Sachs or other businesses. And we've seen that play out. Now, it is true that one of the appeals of Trump to the country filled an old sort of wish list that Americans, many have had for a long time. Why can't we run government like a business? And we are seeing that living experiment, but the business is Trump University. And the people who he has around him have little understanding of how government works or how policy works. Now that's at the White House and the cabinet level. But you can move to the next level. There are about 1,200 positions in the executive branch, maybe just a few less now, that are Senate confirmable. And about 600 of those, 602 is what mostly considered along this line, are the ones that are the real policy-making positions. This is not just the secretaries, but the deputy and undersecretaries, the assistant secretaries, and the heads and deputy heads of agencies and bureaus. A year into this presidency, barely half have been filled. We have gone now for months after one of his cabinet members, going back to kleptocracy, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tom Price, was forced to resign. That department has been run by an acting individual who is a deputy assistant secretary because they haven't had the other positions filled with those who have clout and expertise. We have had a State Department operated almost from the get-go without nearly any of the top positions filled, and most of them not even having nominations until just the last few weeks. And we have gone in many countries without ambassadors, including, just to pick a country at random, South Korea. Now, it would be another thing if you haven't filled those positions, but you have career people who you put great trust in and who you listen to. But of course, there's a war on the career civil service as well, and an attempt to purge these departments, and a Secretary of State who has gone about basically dismantling the diplomatic corps and the development team that the country has spent decades building up into an elite force. And we saw the most recent disaster with the resignation announced today by the ambassador to Panama, who is one of our all-star career people, who said he just can't be in the administration of Donald Trump anymore. So we're losing key people, and we have little concern with making sure that policies are implemented in an effective way. Now, this is a nightmare for anybody who believes in institutions and who believes in governance. So, what's the good news? And there is some good news. And the good news is that we have been jolted as a society by this last election and what's followed from it. And we've been jolted, I would say, in two ways. The first is we have a greater understanding, I think, as a country, that these divisions, the sectarian divisions, the political ones, the racial ones, the regional ones, the divisions along the lines of education and the ability to make a living, are getting to a point of danger, and we're going to have to do something about it. And if we had not had a Donald Trump now, or anybody like that, we might have gone along long enough without addressing some of these things until it was too late. And perhaps it isn't too late now. And we can begin to focus on healing some of those wounds, and we have large elements in the society trying to do that. And the second, of course, is the threat to the system as a whole. And what we've seen is a strong reaction from many elements of our civil society. We saw it with the incredible turnout at the Women's March and other marches right at the beginning of the Trump administration. But we haven't seen what we feared would follow from that, which is a lot of people saying, hey, I marched. And not only that, I worked for a week to make a sign. And it's everywhere, and now I've done my part. But that's continued, and we saw it again with a quite remarkable turnout here in Virginia in November, and we saw it with what happened in Alabama, and we're seeing a mobilization out there that is going to continue, I think. A lot of people have been jolted into realizing that this may be an existential threat to us. We've seen it with the remarkable response of lawyers a group vilified almost as much, if not more, than politicians, stepping up to the plate with the travel bans, moving in many cases to do sterling pro bono work, people going and getting trained in the immigration laws so that they can help people out. And we've seen it in the responses of some of these nonprofit groups, that some of which have been laboring for a long time in the vineyards trying to improve the political system, like the Campaign Legal Center, moving in and bringing lawsuits or moving to change some of the more destructive elements of what we've seen in our political process, from restrictive voter laws to partisan gerrymandering, and all the way up through some of the other abuses taking place in states, and also on the failure to faithfully execute the laws. We've seen it with religious groups, in many cases, stepping up to create broad coalitions. We've seen it with new groups forming to help make some of those things happen. And just as significant to me, we've seen it with a group of conservative, mostly outside, intellectuals and policy leaders saying, we have to save the Republican Party from itself. And here I will say, I have been harshly critical of the Republican Party, and that's been true for some years as I've seen it going astray. And it's not because I want to destroy the Republican Party, but it is because we will not function as a democracy unless we have two problem-solving, energetic, mainstream parties that are going to be different. It's not going to be a moderate Republican Party, it'll be a conservative one, but not a radical one, or one that, with a president that it enables, foments racial and other divisions and creates difficulties both at home and abroad. And whether it is George F. Will or Bill Kristol or Jennifer Rubin or Evan McMullen or Max Boot or a whole host of others who are out there trying to restore that set of genuine conservative values with policies that we may or may not agree with, but that understand that this is not a problem-solving party anymore. We have an opportunity, at least I hope, to begin to move in a slightly different direction. And if we've seen it with only a handful of members, elected members of Congress, most of whom are leaving, like Jeff Flake or Bob Corker, intermittently at least, maybe we will start to see some of this outside pressure and some of the embarrassment that we've seen, especially with the events of the last couple of days, that may be a turning point here that could begin to create a different dynamic. Now, there's no sure thing here. It's not a sure thing that our country, which has had a stable democracy for so long, will continue down that path. It's not a sure thing that people will start to think of themselves as Americans first, that they will no longer view, say, a child marrying somebody from the other party as worse, as we see now in surveys, than a child marrying somebody from a different race or religion. Or that we will continue to have these divisions between both red states and blue states, and within states, between vibrant urban areas and struggling small towns and rural areas. None of those things are sure, but it's also no sure thing that the path that we have been set down in the last year or two will continue to deteriorate. And finally, let me just say, just as heartening has been the response of at least some of the core elements of our free press, which is a linchpin of whether you have a free society. And from the Washington Post and the New York Times, through a whole series of other entities out there that are being courageous and stepping up despite the pressures, it's another sign that the deeper DNA in America, that long set of cultural traditions, may begin to transcend some of those problems that we have and transcend the differences. And with that, I'm trying to be as hopeful as I can. Let me stop and open it up to questions.
he welcomes questions, we've got a microphone in the aisle. Line up, please. Brief questions are best.
Mr. Ornstein, would you comment on Trump's use of the First Amendment to gain power and then more or less keeping the latter away after he's
Use of the First Amendment to
gain political power, and then after he's ascended, he's
Yeah.
kicked
the ladder away, yeah. You know, Trump's notion of the First Amendment is not our notion of the First Amendment. As we've seen already in his complaint about the failure to have libel laws and that people can say whatever they want. You can't make this stuff up. But it wasn't just his use of the First Amendment itself. It was also Trump's understanding, at least at some gut level, of the way modern media works. And one part of it, one thing we mention in the book is he is the first person we've ever seen who has managed to fend off one scandal by having another one, and then another one and another one. But that overwhelms our ability to act as a check and balance. And what we've seen is, I think, a press corps that struggled in a couple of ways. And let's face it, we live in a world now where there are literally millions of news sources. And there's a cacophony out there, and gaining any bit of traction to be able to keep an audience, to have a business model that works, is difficult. And we also live in a world where getting attention comes with shock value. But a world as well where some of the norms of journalism, I would say, have actually worked against what we need in this society. I'm going to answer your question by taking it back one step further. Tom Mann and I did a book in 2012 called It's Even Worse Than It Looks. And that book got a lot of attention because we said the Republican Party had become an insurgent outlier and outlined some of the things that 6 years later are all too apparent. But the desire to show that you would report both sides of the story, even if there weren't two sides to a story, there might have been 12 sides to a story, there might be one side, meant that they got away with a lot of stuff. And Trump got away with a lot of stuff as people struggled to normalize him and to say, well, it's Hillary Clinton and it's Donald Trump and we're going to report both sides. And again, it was a loss of perspective. At the same time, Trump and the people around him have understood that if you create a shiny object, people are going to follow it. And it will take attention away from some of the other excesses out there. So he's used that, even as he has attacked regularly the people who have helped him get away with it. Not quite murder yet that we know of, but maybe another day with broad daylight and Fifth Avenue tomorrow.
Could you talk a little, about some of maybe in the countervailing force side, about the role that maybe states' rights, some of the efforts, where the resistance is going to come from, in other words, local, state, and whether we've, as the Democrats, of course, have heavily emphasized federal authority sweeping over the states. Republicans now seem to be, of course, jumping on that bandwagon when it suits them.
Situational ethics or situational ideology works a lot in this way. And clearly what has happened is that we've seen very different reactions in states, and that there are states that are either enacting policies to counter some of the things coming through the administration. And one of the areas that's gotten almost no attention has been the dismantlement of regulations in health and safety, in the environment, and elsewhere, that states are starting to move into counter a little bit. But an effort, I think, by Trump and the feds to block as much of that they don't like as they possibly can. So there is no 10th Amendment that means much of anything that conservatives used to talk about all the time now, if it countermands what they're trying to do. But I would mention one other element here that is just as disturbing when it comes to the Trump presidency. And I would tell you, I've now been in Washington for just a touch under 50 years. And I've been able during that time to get to know a lot of people who are significant figures in the political arena, and that includes knowing some presidents fairly well, and others I've known, not as well, but watched up close. One, every president I've ever seen, no matter how much experience, the day and moment that that president realizes that he will be a president changes him, transforms him. I saw with George Herbert Walker Bush. Who could have more experience than that? Including, of course, 8 years previously being in the Oval Office when all the decisions were made. But all of a sudden, he's the one making the decisions. And presidents suddenly realize that they now are not just candidates responding to a narrower group, they represent the country as a whole. Here you have a president who's taken a set of actions aimed at hurting blue states and helping red states. And we see that in the tax bill, and we see it in the reactions to disaster relief. You see it in the growing, unconscionable unwillingness to help out Puerto Rico, Americans, where more than half the country still has no electricity, and the number of deaths is much higher than has been reported and will grow even more. And that's just a very different phenomenon. We have a guy who did not change one iota the day he became president and is still focused on a smaller sliver of the society and not on the country as a whole. And that you can't sustain. And that's one where you do pit one state against another. And we're seeing, I think, even now, the sort of really clever reaction of some states to try and get around the punitive measure on state and local tax deductions aimed at those blue states to try and turn it against them. And some of that will succeed. But it is simply unlike any other kind of governance that we've seen before. It's so much different than what we had with Ronald Reagan or George Herbert Walker Bush or George Bush, much less any of the others who've been president in the last 50 years. Yes.
Would you care to speak about what the Trump administration has done in terms of our position in the world today?
So,
foreign policy.
So one of the things that a couple of commentators said today that I've been thinking as well is the shithole comment is going to have large reverberations out there around the world. All of these countries, in Africa, in Central America, are important to us. They're not just important as trading partners, it's not just important in terms of the human relationships, but we rely on them for intelligence. We rely on them for help. We often rely on them because we have troops present or we need overflight. And the incentive to do those things is just so much less. Many of you have, I'm sure, as I have, traveled in different places in the world now. And the reaction is unlike anything I've ever seen before. There have been times in the past where you'd have to justify the unjustifiable or explain why we were doing some things that people didn't like very much. But this is different now. And that, along with the fact that we don't have the diplomatic corps and the presence out there around the world, and the fact that even though you do have some people, Theresa May, of course, trying the other day valiantly to say that he's not insane, the president is not insane, and then being rewarded by having the president give her a middle finger by saying, well, I'm not going to Britain. After all, they, and this was, a bunch of mischaracterizations and lies, as he tweeted. The Obama administration sold our embassy in such a great place at a bargain basement price and then moved into some awful area. Of course, it was the Bush administration that sold it. And a part of the reason was because it was right in a main area where it was more vulnerable. But it's just, basically sticking it to one of our closest allies. So this is damage, some of which will not be undone for a very long period of time. And I really feel for the great Americans who continue to serve us in the diplomatic corps, in the development world, in the military abroad, who are going to have to deal with the fallout from all of this. Yes.
I don't know how well your crystal ball is working this evening, but you haven't said much about the Russia investigation. So my question is, what do you think the outcome of the Mueller investigation will be?
One answer is we don't know exactly, but what we do know is there's an awful lot there. And we know, among other things, that if you take a Michael Flynn, whose offenses are apparent and horrific, including as a national security advisor, conspiring to kidnap an American in return for a large sum of money to spirit him off to Turkey. Not to mention his ties with Russia, his lies about his own business dealings and contacts when he was applying for the security clearances and the like. And you give him the equivalent of a jaywalking offense. You're not going to do that unless he has given you an enormous amount in return. Now, how much that touches the president, none of us know. What we do know is that he's brought on the best money laundering and forensic specialists and forensic accountants and cybersecurity people available out there. And all of that would suggest that offenses ranging from obstruction of justice to money laundering to other things are going to be there for a significant number of people, including very likely members of his own family. And whether and how it hits him, we don't know. I wouldn't expect a quick resolution of it, though, because I think if you are Robert Mueller, you're going to want to get every bit of evidence and all of your ducks in a row before you emerge with this. And what kind of a crisis that causes in the country and in governments. One thing you can say is every time that the president tweets something outrageous, it's usually on a day when there's some other revelation from one of those people who's under the microscope of the investigation, and that's a sign that there's a lot there. Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Mayor. Norm, nice to have you here. We've known each other for 30 years, and I'm one of those publishers who told us reporters to stop quoting you. The reason being is the best quote Meister could ever serve, and you can see that. A question which I don't bring much more down to the mundane or local level. There will be a congressional election in this district, obviously, next year. We're in the 5th congressional district, which you probably know. It is historically a Republican district, 55, 56% Republican. Even this county is 55 or so percent, notwithstanding the response that you've gotten from this group. It's not like typical.
Yeah.
There are 4 candidates running for the Democratic nomination, one of whom happens to live in this county, Leslie Coburn. And they will run against a one-term congressional conservative Republican, Tom Cavanaugh, who replaced a conservative Republican who got so fed up with the whole system he quit. If you were advising any one of these candidates, what would be your campaign? Other than saying Donald Trump is Donald Trump. And you're a conservative district, and you got a south side with a lot of hard-working people. What would you advise a candidate to do in terms of running a campaign to get elected?
Sure.
Opposed to making us happy.
So I guess you could put this in a couple of different directions, John. One is, if you're looking at this from just the purely, ruthlessly pragmatic one, what happens in midterm elections usually is that the president's party is demoralized and depressed, and they stay home disproportionately, and the out party is angry and they turn out. And what you want to do is maximize your turnout and minimize theirs. And one of the things that that tells you is that you want to calibrate your stridency a little bit, because the danger that Democrats have this next time is that we're driven by negative partisanship. People are motivated far more by their hatred for the other side than they are by their attachment to their own. And if you trigger some of that negative partisanship, then you're going to see Republicans in this case have some traction by saying, no matter how bad this guy is, you cannot let the enemy win. And some of the support for Trump has been on that front. It's just the reluctance, if he loses, they win. But you need to keep that enthusiasm from your own side. Now the second part of it, and in our book, Did I mention it makes a great holiday? If not, remind me. We have some chapters on the roadmap, where to go from here. And some of it is an economic roadmap. And some of it also relates to some of the racial divisions. And I think Democrats make a mistake if they turn their focus to the white working class. The focus should be on the working class. The problems transcend race in those areas. And it really does mean not coming up with a fully detailed program, but a sense of empathy for those who are trying and struggling to make it. And in particular, what I've thought for many, many years, and this also is not it shouldn't be a partisan issue. We have a social contract in this country, and that social contract is if you work and you show up and you do your 30 or 40 hours a week, in return, you're supposed to get the ability to put a roof over your heads, to educate your family and put food on the table, and maybe have a little bit left over for some leisure time. And we're not fulfilling that in any fashion. And turning to that, it seems to me, is really important. And at the same time, we are seeing the fundamental safety net shredded. And what we're also seeing is, in some ways, the rock is being taken up and we're seeing real attitudes underneath. And here you have an Orrin Hatch talking about how, well, we don't have the money for things like CHIP anymore. And after all, you're talking about all these people who are just leeching off the rest of us. We are back to the makers and the takers. And of course, the fact is, the takers include all of those people who are getting a low tax rate for carried interest, not to mention the retirees who are getting Social Security, but also people who have lots of reasons, from disabilities and others, where they're going to struggle to even get by in the slightest way. And you've hit a hobby horse of mine in this case. I did a piece a little while ago. We have the 40th anniversary of the Food Stamp Act. Okay? We're cutting food stamps. The number of people in this country who are food insecure, who don't go through a month without having some periods of hunger, has soared, despite the fact that we have an economy with low unemployment now. And they did a study in South Carolina where they were able to do a remarkable set of controls. Kids who took achievement tests late in the month, when they'd run out of the food stamps, performed much more poorly even than the same kids taking the same test early in the month when they had food in their bellies. So we are undermining the entire society and the workforce of the future, and taking away the ability of people to have a chance to succeed in what's supposed to be a country where we say you can succeed to the fullest extent of your abilities. If we undermine those abilities, and I would run on that. I'd run hard on that. Yes?
You talk a lot about the senior leadership, Trump, the Trump administration, but you haven't talked much about the rank and file, the rock ridges of this nation. You've seen places out. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. What could you comment on that, especially their mindset now, these days? Because I'm from Culpeper. I looked on Facebook, on my newsfeed, not a lot of the Trump supporters among, my Facebook friends, they're pretty silent these days.
Yeah. So, this is it's a tough one to address in different ways. The first is, we see a lot of the analysis now of Trump's comment the other day about how, well, he's talking to his base, and a lot of them are like that. And I don't like that kind of analysis, first of all, because the reality is you made a racist comment. It's a racist comment. You don't justify it by saying, well, he's appealing to a group of people. There is a group of people out there who do feel that way. At the same time, you have a whole lot of people who voted for Trump, and maybe some of them harbor racial resentment, but they've also struggled in their lives at a time when we've had limited increase in wages and all kinds of problems in getting by, and now you have an opioid crisis and other things going on, and people who felt that their voice wasn't heard. And Trump lied to them as he seduced them. He is the phoniest populist ever, and he has shown that over and over again. And I will tell you that trying to build in a work requirement for Medicaid is going to stick it to a whole lot of those people who supported him. And the tax bill sticks it to them, and the undermining the safety net, the regulations that are going to pose greater health problems to people living in Appalachia and other places, all of that. But they had some legitimate concerns. Now, I think you're seeing silence in part because, one, that tribalism that I mentioned. You got people who don't want to criticize him because then they're in bed with those who they still view as being evil or bad. And then there are those who somehow continue to believe, in part because of what they read and see and what they don't read. You have a core group of Trump people who don't believe he's played golf.
Yeah.
You know, if you ever watched Jay Leno's jaywalking, you realize that we do have a group of people who are sort of not too smart. But if we ignore the fact that there are legitimate concerns out there that go beyond a core Trump support, and if we also consider that Trump's support has declined, even among some of that core, and my guess is that what's happened in the last couple of days may make that happen even a little bit more, then we're ignoring another reality. And I would say we need to address those concerns. We have to look at those who have genuine reasons for wanting to say, blow the place up, how could it be any worse, even though they're now seeing that it was worse. But we cannot justify or enable the ugly, racist, anti-Semitic sentiments that are now being justified and viewed in a very different light, and where people are now willing to come out of the shadows because they think they got a president who's with them. And no matter what he says, when you have David Duke saying, boy, we finally have a president who's with us, take it to the bank.
I've always imagined that people who run for public office, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, part of the motivation has got something to do with the greater good or making things better for people. I've always imagined there was some moral impetus when people run for office, and I suppose that's not true across the board. So my biggest dilemma these days is trying to understand half of Congress, or more than half of Congress, especially in the House of Representatives, whose responsibility it is, for example, if we had an incompetent president to raise impeachment proceedings. I'm trying to understand what's going on in those people's moral gymnasium. Are they struggling with, they can't not know he's incompetent. They can't not know the things he says are not presidential and are dangerous. Do you have any hope that the moral struggles that I imagine that are going on among these Republicans, especially in the House of Representatives, will, one by one, maybe will say, I just can't stick with this. This is impossible. Shithole countries is more than I can do. I'm thinking of, Lowell Weicker during the war, our Republican Lowell Weicker from Connecticut. So I'm just wondering, do you see that as a possibility, one after the other, saying, I have to say and act for what's right for the country?
So first let me say one other thing on the hopeful side that I didn't mention. We're seeing a slew of candidates emerge, including people who've never run for office before. Young people, and one of the other boards I'm on is the Volcker Alliance, Paul Volcker, and we've tried for years to get people to go into public service, young people. And the response has generally been, I don't want to do that, it's a cesspool, I'll maybe do an NGO. Now they're running for office because they see the real challenge. The number of women running for office, including many for the first time running for Congress, it's astonishing. So we may be getting a return to people running for the right reasons. Not everybody does. Some do it for ambition. Some even do it for the money. But we have had a lot of people who do it for noble reasons. it's hard to figure entirely what the motives are of people who should be independent in Congress, at least looking to patriotism and some of the fundamental moral values. But there are a couple of things. One is radicalism, the radicalization of the party. That includes a tribal media that just reinforces it, and the incentives moving forward, including the financial ones, are going to those who are more on the crazy side. And what troubles me as much as anything is I read what members of state legislatures say around the country, and they make the Freedom Caucus look like the socialist wing. And that's a part of it. A second part of it is fear. It's the fact is, if Donald Trump's base is 25 to 30% of the country, it's 65 to 75% of the base of all these Republicans in Congress. And they also know that Trump has an army of media acolytes. Sean Hannity, Tucker Carlson, Rush Limbaugh, Rupert Murdoch behind those scenes, Laura Ingraham. And for many of them, they saw what happened to Eric Cantor. And it was Laura Ingraham and Mark Levin who did as much to bring him down as anybody else. And they know that Trump has the Mercers and the Kochs, and now a whole lot of others, because the tax bill gave them even more money, who could pour plenty into challenging them in primaries. And so they're very hesitant to criticize him. And you keep wondering what the final straw will be. And if yesterday wasn't the final straw, we may not have a final straw. And I have to say, it's not just the House. I've been good friends with Bob Corker and Lindsey Graham. And I've just ripped them on Twitter, and Lindsey especially, who I hope will return to his roots. But the guy who set the standard, there comes a time when you put country over party. But when you're out there playing golf with Trump and talking about how wonderful he is, and then criticizing those who said that he is a kook after you or yourself had said he was a kook, and then you take it to the next level, and you can justify that maybe. I know the guy is a narcissist and he responds to fulsome praise, and maybe I'll be able to influence him a little bit in the right direction. But when you then take on the water of bringing a criminal complaint against Steele, which means that you're with the Russians, that takes it too far. And you just hope that we will have some people who will put country over the party before it's too long. And if they don't, I do think that you're going to see the fallout in elections. And the other frank reality here is you don't change a party and change its approach to policy or its approach to the society unless they get their asses kicked in elections. That's what jolts them back to a reality. Yes, maybe this will be the last one.
We forget for a moment the failings of politicians as people, Republicans or Democrats, and we presume that there is a discussion to be had about the Electoral College, because I don't see either coast changing your opinion in the next election. Maybe more so, maybe less manipulative, maybe less reliant on 3 Midwest states. But is there a point where it isn't a Republican issue, it isn't a Democrat issue, it's a Founding Fathers issue, it's a why would we change it now issue? What is your feeling about the Electoral College?
So, I try not to get into some of these structural issues because I wanted to have a little bit of a high note as we went. But the Electoral College is not what the framers anticipated, not just because we don't have electors that mean anything anymore, but because it's tilted increasingly towards small, homogeneous states. They have much more clout. The votes of individuals in Wyoming are worth about 8 times what the votes are for individuals in California. And that means that we're going to have more and more elections. We had, in the period from when we first had popular votes that had any meaning at all, 1824, all the way up through 1996, 44 elections, 3, but really only 1, where you could make a strong case that the winner of the popular vote lost the presidency. 5 elections since 2. And we're going to have more of those. And the more we have, the more we will cast doubt on the legitimacy of the election outcomes. We're not going to get a constitutional amendment to change the Electoral College because there's too much at stake for too many states. But I've been a strong supporter of the Popular Vote Compact, which is an effort that now has states representing 165 of the 270 electoral votes that have passed legislation that says that when you've gotten over that threshold, they will instruct their electoral votes to go to the winner of the national popular vote. So it could happen. But I will tell you that difficult as that is, there's one other figure I want you to keep in mind. And I'll put aside the gerrymandering for now, and I am very, very hopeful that our hero Paul Smith will bring us to the rescue. At least by putting a standard in place for partisan gerrymandering, we'll put some limits on what's done there. But by 2040 or so, 70% of Americans will live in 15 states. Now, what does that mean? It means 30% of Americans will have 70 senators representing them. And those 30% are also from more homogeneous, white, older areas. And that is a challenge that you can't easily solve without completely transforming the constitutional system. But the Senate has become increasingly distorted, even more than the Electoral College. And I don't have an easy answer for that, but it's another one of the challenges that we have as we go along, because a country that had a relatively limited ratio between the smallest and largest states in population when the framers created the system has been changed dramatically. And we now live in an urban country, but where the people who live in and around the cities and who live in the states where people are moving have less and less clout. And that's not a good thing, especially as we become more diverse. Yes, last question.
You highlighted early on in your talk the importance of Cantor's loss and the whole immigration issue. We were within a whisker of having a bipartisan bill passed that could perhaps deal with it. And now, in this shithole moment, the apologists on that point of view are all showing us, we're bringing up Canada and Australia as examples of cultural immigration strategies. Parenthetically, none of them have skin color as one of the scorecards that they use. Where can we possibly go in resolving this very difficult issue, whether in today's environment or subsequently?
I'm not sure. We have a short-term question. And the short-term question is whether we're going to shut down the government or end up getting a resolution at least that solves the Dreamer problem with DACA and maybe does something along the lines of what was a pretty bipartisan compromise with Lindsey Graham and Dick Durbin. That was the one they took to the White House when the president made his comments. That also does reasonable things on chain migration and on some of the other issues. It wasn't a longer-term solution, but at least would have done some very good things. And maybe he'll bring it back, because I don't think Republicans want to shut down the government. And I think now, after the president's comments, it would be very much easier for Democrats to portray a shutdown as occurring because Donald Trump threw a grenade into the middle of this bipartisan process. But whether the Democrats are skillful enough to pull that off, and whether they can come up with a compromise that will overcome the anti-immigration sentiments of a majority of House Republicans, and will get Paul Ryan, who has been one of the greatest disappointments, period, in our political system, who has operated as Speaker of the Republican Party and plutocrats and not Speaker of the House, including his mealy-mouthed comments on Trump's response the other day, whether he will then do what will be necessary, which is to bring this up while getting more Democratic votes than Republicans. I just don't know right now. And some of it is going to depend on how well Democrats, who are no angels here, by the way. It's not like I'm saying that one party is great and the other isn't. but the differences are starker than they have been before. How much they'll be able to pull this off. The fact is, a longer-term solution to the immigration problem remains elusive for now. And I will tell you one other thing. Somebody who's disappointed me even more than Ryan is John Kelly, who took over Homeland Security and blew up any part of a culture that would have been a humane one. And the way that ICE agents have behaved out there, the sadistic acts, the inhumanity, the idea, which he brought to it before he left to move to the White House, the idea now that you are going to deport somebody who's been in this country and working and doing well for decades, who is the sole trained caregiver for a 6-year-old quadriplegic, and leave that kid, an American, to potentially die when this guy has done nothing except drive with an expired license. I just can't even begin to say how outrageous and immoral that is, and I blame Kelly.
On a higher note, I was looking at a major electoral change in 2018 and 2020. You haven't talked much about the Democratic Party side and how the divisions in that party will affect, obviously, the election, both in 2018 and 2020. Could you talk a little about what the Democrats have, what they have to do, and what they have to avoid?
Sure. So one thing is, the polarization has been asymmetric, no doubt about it. But there's a Newtonian element to American politics, to any politics. And an action can bring an equal and opposite reaction. And Democrats have to be very careful that they don't verge towards an unacceptable left-wing position that's outside of the mainstream and that leaves the middle pretty much unoccupied. Now, I think they've done a reasonably good job on that front, although I will tell you I am constantly perplexed that a Bernie Sanders, who was never a Democrat for a day in his life until he ran for president, who left the party as soon as he dropped out of the presidential race, is the arbiter of the rules for the Democratic Party selecting a nominee. It's just hard to get your arms around that. But what we've seen is, if you look at 2018, you've got conservative Democrats up for seats in the Senate. Heidi Heitkamp in North Carolina, Joe Manchin in West Virginia. We have them in Indiana with Joe Donnelly, in Montana with John Tester. And you're not seeing left-wing challenges to them that could destroy the unity of the party or pull it in a direction where they're going to lose those seats. Which we have seen, of course, over and over again on the Republican side, and we're seeing it again now in Arizona, where Joe Arpaio is running. We are not seeing the crazy and unacceptable candidates. 4 major Republican candidates were convicted, mostly felons. Arpaio says it was a misdemeanor, but I'll call him a felon. And we're not seeing the extremists running at this point. And if the measure of Democrats moving outside the mainstream is that 15 senators have co-sponsored a single-payer health care plan, that's kind of a weird definition of what's outside the mainstream given the rest of the world. But that's a danger. And at the same time, there are going to be 20 candidates running in 2020. It'll be a zoo, just like the Republicans had. 10 of them will make it onto a main stage. 10 will be in a kiddie debate. Who knows who emerges in a fashion that captures attention when you have a 2-hour debate, maybe you've got 10 minutes overall in which you're going to be able to talk. And this, I tell you, this appeal to another outsider, the Oprah business. The last thing we need after a Donald Trump is somebody who doesn't know anything about governing. And I will grant you that Oprah is one impressive lady, but this is also a woman who made Dr. Oz a national celebrity. And I'm not sure I want an administration where Dr. Oz is the Surgeon General.